Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Maaza Gidey. This is a continuation of our Twitter series that is being organized by the Tigray Advisory Council in the North America in commemoration of the 2 years of the beginning of the Tigray genocide. The council has been organizing a series of Twitter discussions whereby we invite different intellectuals, politicians, thought leaders, and advocates to discuss various topics that are affecting the people of Tigray, Africans, and humanity at large. In today's discussion, we will focus on international relations and the war on Tigray. I believe today we have a list of distinguished speakers that are experts in different issues related to the topic. They will share their expert opinion with us on the topic, and hopefully their opinion would help us understand what's happening um, on the ground and uh, the situation we're in more comprehensively. We recognize the fact that things are quite uncertain at the moment. There is so much unknown. Obviously, everyone is aware that peace agreement has been signed in South Africa yesterday, but the details of that discussion, that agreement, are still very much um, on the limbo. So I'm confident the speakers we have today, to a certain degree, will help us even understand that further. Important to highlight the fact that we're having this discussion at the backdrop of Tigray still being under complete blockade and under complete attack. Just within less than a day since the agreement was signed, Tigray has been bombarded on different fronts. Civilians' casualties are still being faced with the genocidal atrocities launched both by the Eritrean and the Ethiopian allied genocidal forces. We also want to commemorate the lives that have been lost during the past 2 years at the hands of the genocidal Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, as well as the local Amhara militia. It's really important to highlight the fact that the people of Tigray have been committed to peace from the very beginning. However, our plea and call for peace has been ignored, and it has been faced with unimaginable level of brutality, um, particularly um, affecting the well-being and the safety of Tigrans while infringing our democratic and constitutional rights. Nonetheless, the people of Tigray still remain resilient and hopeful in their pursuit of justice and peace. Although an agreement has been signed, the people still haven't gotten a break. They're still being bombarded. They're still being starved. Um, and so this makes it all the more important for members of the international community to carefully follow the developments on the ground and continue to push the genocidal actors that have been waging havoc against the people of Tigray for over 2 years now. It is with that note that today we have brought such a distinguished panel to you. We're trying to figure out some technical issues, so I kindly ask everybody to be a little bit more patient with us. Just give us a few more minutes to finalize everything, and we'll start. In the meantime, please go ahead and share this space and make sure you tag relevant members of the international community so that they hear from experts on the topic and also from Tigrans that are directly being affected by this. Thank you so much.
And everybody, good evening.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. We finally managed everything. So we'll go ahead and start our conversation. I will first introduce our moderator, and then our moderator will carry us through this discussion. First of all, thank you, everybody, once again for being here. It's an honor to have all these speakers and the moderator join us today. Um, our moderator is called Dr. Sarah Vaughan. She is a social scientist who has worked in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa since the late 1980s, advising a series of governmental, multilateral, academic, and non governmental bodies. She was for 20 years an honorary fellow of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh and has taught African politics and social theory in Scotland and Ethiopia. She works on a range of aspects of the political economy of Ethiopia and the reign and is co-author of The Culture of the Power in Contemporary Ethiopian Political Life, a book that was published in 2014. And she is also an amazing advocate and a role model for so many of us that want to aspire a career on academia and in the political science field. So it's an honor to have her here today to moderate this conversation for us. So thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Please take it away.
Maza, you're too kind. Thanks very much. And good evening, everybody from Europe. Before we start, and I'm sorry that we're starting rather later than scheduled, I just want to take a moment to recognize the enormity of the anniversary that we're marking tonight. This evening, as it grew dark in Europe, dark in Ethiopia, it is 2 years since the war in Tigray began. For the last 2 years, for many of us and many of you listening, we've had our lives turned upside down by the sheer horror of what has been done in Tigray. We've lost contact with loved ones and old colleagues and dear friends, and many we know to have been killed. We've lost identities, relationships, friendships that we thought were secure and in which we delighted. And we've been left instead with bitterness, grief, and loss. We've lived through horror, trauma, and devastation, and we still live with the fear that what we know of the situation in Tigray now is only the tip of the iceberg of the losses that have been inflicted and the damage that's been done on the ground. A part of the world that we care about has been terribly, hideously changed by these 2 years of war. And we have also been changed by the experience of the last 2 years. And I think we need to recognize that these changes will take a very long time to process, let alone to heal. Yesterday, the Ethiopian government and the Tigray government of the TPLF signed an agreement for a permanent cessation of hostilities, which came into effect apparently at midnight. A lot remains really unclear about what it means in practice. Can it be implemented? What does it mean for justice and accountability in the future, in Tigray or in Ethiopia more broadly? We also remember that violence continues in other parts of Ethiopia with particular intensity in areas of Western Oromia, and that it is months, if not years, since we have known what has become, for instance, of the people of Metakal in Benishangul Gumuz and many other areas. But this peace deal may bring some very precious things. There is a chance that the slaughter may today have stopped in Tigray, although there are reports in the last few hours that this may not be the case. Tigrayans may now quickly receive the food and medicine they need to survive and may be released from arbitrary detention, may return to their homes and land, we hope. A political solution may now be sought to what was always a political problem, and one that should never have been allowed to descend into violence, let alone to have been deliberately fanned into war. If this happens, these are potentially huge steps forward and much to be valued, even in the face of the terrible uncertainty and persisting anger over what deal may or may not have been done. These may be initial steps that should let us breathe, should let us square our shoulders and face the future, even amidst the terrible hesitation, fear, or frustration. That being said, it's my great pleasure to invite you this evening to listen to three distinguished speakers, two Africans, analysts and politicians, and one a European lawyer and human rights advocate. Each of them is particularly well placed to consider our topic this evening, international relations and the war in Tigray. There's a lot to discuss, so many levels of international involvement in the war. The neighboring countries, especially Eritrea and Somalia, who sent troops to Tigray, but also the roles of Kenya, Djibouti, and Sudan. The roles of regional and continental bodies, IGAD and the AU. Then there's the wider region and the Gulf states, including several states which are known to have armed or bankrolled Ethiopia's military, Turkey, the UAE, Iran, amongst others. There are the major donors to Ethiopia, especially the US and the EU, and there are those who block discussion at the UN, notably Russia and China, and until relatively recently, the A3 group of countries, the African members. So it's a big canvas. Let me briefly introduce to you the three speakers who are going to share the conversation this evening. Zitto Kabwe is a Tanzanian opposition politician who was MP for Kigoma district for 10 years from 2005 to 2015. He served as chair of the powerful Public Accounts Committee and was influential in the passage of Tanzania's Mining Act, designed to curb corruption in 2010. In March 2015, he joined the Alliance for Change and Transparency, ACT, which he leads. A powerful voice in international solidarity on the continent and beyond, this year Zitto visited Ukraine and co-authored an open letter in South Africa's Daily Maverick calling on African Democrats to close ranks in defense of Ukraine. We need to be pro-Ukraine since that is to be pro-Africa and the values we stand for. Welcome, Zitto. Secondly, Dr. Evelina Ochab is a lawyer and human rights advocate, an author and co-founder of the Coalition on Genocide Response. She's based in the UK. She's worked on genocide and the protection of minorities in Syria and Iraq, in West Africa, and in relation to atrocities perpetrated against the Uyghur and Rohingya minorities in China and Myanmar, respectively. She's a regular contributor to UN reporting on human rights, including universal periodic reviews. In particular, she made an exceptionally important intervention during the September meeting of the Human Rights Council on Ethiopia, calling for more attention to the presence of the indicators under the 2014 framework on genocide. These include in particular the hate speech, which has so often been neglected in discussions about Tigray and Ethiopia. Dr. Faisal Roble is our final speaker. He's a political analyst and writer of Somali origin based in California. He's a former editor-in-chief of the influential White Hair News, currently a principal planner for the city of Los Angeles. In 2018, he wrote, and this is before the current Prime Minister came to power, Ethiopia's embattled Prime Minister Haile Mariam is faced with serious political challenges. The most salient is whether he can balance the rights afforded to the 9 regions in the federation. The history of the empire has been the struggle for equality of nations and nationalities. Democratization of the country also hinges on this aspect of the political history of the empire. It's therefore inescapable, he wrote, to fully implement Article 39 and equalize the powers and status of all the 9 regional governments. Yesterday, Faisal tweeted, "Peace under a functional constitution is priceless." So welcome also, Dr. Faisal. Perhaps may I start with you, Faisal. As I mentioned, there are many different levels of international engagement in the war in Tigray. I wondered if you might be able to tell us something about the most proximate of those, about the neighboring countries and their role in the conflict. Particularly, for instance, Eritrea and Somalia have sent in troops to the Tigray war in the early period and continuing now. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about the role of the neighboring countries? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to my colleagues and to everybody who is in this space. I would like to also really take my hat off for the young generation who have really sleeplessly campaigned against genocide that's taking place in Tigray. It's very interesting to see how this war created two different spaces, both in terms of academics, politics, as well as in social media. One space like this one campaigning to stop genocide and perfect Ethiopia's journey to a better place than where it is today. And a second space that has been really justifying genocide, massacre, and the absence of democratic governance in Ethiopia. Two stark spaces, and hopefully one of these days we can bring the gap between these two groups. I think the involvement of the regional governments in the Ethiopian Tigray conflict is very sharp and stark when you look at two countries, mainly Somalia and Eritrea. I will leave Sudan out for the time being because Sudan and Ethiopia has, this back and forth type relationship, and a lot of the accusations that leveled against Sudan supplying arms to TDF, TPLF is really difficult to verify, but I can speak very well to the Eritrean involvement and that of Somalia. With Somalia, we have heard and have yet to really learn the magnitude of the 5,000 Somali soldiers' involvement in the conflict. We have heard and seen some written commentaries, but I think up to this day, we have to see a very clear uh, uh, evidence as to the Somali soldiers in the conflict. However, during the Farmacho years, the Somali government has given Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, a needed space for him to show that the war in Tigray and the war against TPLF, as he likes to put it, was not only one against Ethiopia, but also one carried by the regional governments who want to stabilize the region. By reaching out to TPLF's challenges in Somalia, and for that matter, EPRDF's challenges in Somalia in the 1900s and 2000 and afterwards, and the heavy bombardment that EPRDF carried in Mogadishu, Abiy was at a very opportune place to sell this idea to the regime of Farmajo, who himself was at one time a beneficiary and ally to EPRDF, but nonetheless, he gave Abiy that cover that he needed. With Eritrea, as many of you who are here know, that there is a long history of animosity between TPLF and Eritrea. Isaias never made it secret his hate towards TPLF, and probably he is the one who coined the phrase of disarm TPLF and dismantle TPLF, a slogan that has been found very easy for the pro-war groups to catch that and then even dictate for Abiy to make that as part of his negotiation issues, which in my opinion at this point in time is probably, if we don't handle it carefully, probably would undermine this badly needed peace agreement between the two sides. There are two forces in the Ethiopian theater that probably would have difficulty to give or forgive TPLF, even if TPLF becomes a disarmed regular citizens. That would be the Eritrean elite and the now deconstructed but sort of morphed former EPRP leaders who never forgot their past relationship with TPLF. And both of those groups do have ample access to Aret Kilo, the powerhouse in Ethiopia. what we have seen so far, I'm afraid, would be the tip of the iceberg, in the sense that these two forces, although they have abundantly participated in what they call disarming and decimating TPLF, they probably will also fight hard now to put Abiy in a position that he may himself undermine this, you know, hastily put together peace agreement as a peace proposal. So I think, yes, Eritrea has participated heavily, but we have more homework to do in terms of where this would land. One thing that I like to just add to this subject is uh, Ethiopia's, what I call Ethiopia's exceptionalism has always, under any regime, whether it was under EPRDF, under Haile Selassie, and even at Mengistu, and now, always thrives when it comes to international relations and in the eyes of the world vis-a-vis its citizens who are demanding rights and democratic rights, if you will. Now, we knew that the Western forces, seen as Haile Selassie took power as a young king, not only nurtured Ethiopia, but supported all along, despite what the pro-war groups have been saying in the last 2 years. Uh, but I think the new forces that were non-traditional supporters of Ethiopia, that supplied Prime Minister Abiy's government with little weapons, are the Islamic world, selected Islamic world, that is Turkey, Iran, United Arab Emirates. In the past, we have known that Ethiopia was part of the scramble for Africa. It was the only African force that sat at the Berlin Conference. In the Second World War, it was a huge beneficiary of the spoils that came after the Second World War. In the third iteration of the Horn of Africa, and probably Africa, the new second force that is now in the equation, and literally in the equation, is the Middle Eastern and Turkey equation, which has shown us within 2 years that they can even be as worse, if not worse, than what we have seen with the West in terms of international diplomacy. So all those groups have played a significant role in the Tigray theater. They still continue. Their armaments and weapons and financial purse is still there. And I think until we find a solution to the Middle Eastern involvement, plus the Russian issue and the Chinese who are interested in the Ogaden oil, which we will come back later on probably, all those forces are really beneficiary of the conflict. And I don't know how much effort they will put into arrest and bring this conflict into a peaceful resolution. And with that, I will stop and probably will come back later on. Thank you very much.
Dr. Faisal, thank you very much. You've brought an extremely interesting point already about the Islamic world and some of the Middle Eastern states, and a new pattern, or a new version of an old pattern, perhaps, which is affecting the Horn. Zitto, if I may, let me come to you and ask from your perspective in Tanzania how you see the role of African players vis-a-vis this conflict. I see that you have been relatively outspoken on the Tigray issue when really few other African politicians have taken that approach. I wonder why you think that is, and is there something in your background, for instance, that makes you see this situation differently from others? Zitto, over to you for your reflections.
Thank you so much, moderator, for the opportunity, but also thank you to Meaza for inviting me to be part of this very, very important discussion. Important because of the whole issue that we're discussing about, but also very, very sad because of the loss of life and properties that has been happening over the last 2 years in Tigray. I will start with addressing the question that you have put forward. I think the African mentality is that of simply unity, regardless of the cost, or unity at any cost. And the morning I woke up and saw a statement from federal government about what it called law and order operation in Tigray, I knew that this narrative will be swallowed blindly by many people in government and outside government. And I was right. But I did not swallow it immediately. From day one, I read between the line and I saw this is going to happen. What we saw in Rwanda is what is going to happen in Tigray. And in no time, I was proven right. It was not the so-called law and order, but it was simply an attempt of the federal government to annihilate the whole ethnic group in northern Ethiopia. So through making noises, I tried at different levels to involve fellow opposition figures in the region, in East Africa and in SADC region, to raise the voice against the war. And I got some response which were really sad that that is an internal matter of Ethiopia, and the federal government is dealing with it. So there is nothing to do, even issuing statement showing solidarity or calling for a UN investigation, an independent investigation, and the likes. The things that we have been calling for since November 2020. But in the course of the work, we started to see some people changing their opinion, although not coming out very forcefully. But at one point in time, there was a change of opinion. And then later, TDF was making big successes. And then the retreat that happened. And more people started to understand this war. And I think the whole blame about the prolongation of the war rests on the African Union. It took first of all, the African Union supported the Ethiopian government line, the narrative that it was law and order. And due to that, there was no debate. Even when the group of eminent people visited Ethiopia for the first time after the war, there was no cooperation from the federal government, but also the African Union did not come up with any strong statement about it. And also we started to see the behavior and actions or inactions of the representatives of Africa in the Security Council, the so-called A3. And it was very discouraging that it was the Africans who were blocking the debate about Tigray at the UN Security Council. And it was the Western countries like Ireland and the likes who were sponsoring for motions to discuss the situation in Tigray. So we have observed the 2 years of failure in continental diplomacy. The 2 years of losing more than 500,000 people in an African country, the 2 years of shame that one sovereign state can ask another sovereign state to invade its own country, kill its people, rape its women, and take away the properties or even destroy the properties that they cannot take away. And it is something that I am very sure the historians, the future historians, in the very near future, will come to right this shame that a sovereign country inviting another country to invade its own territory, kill its people, rape its women, and destroy properties and the likes. And during all this time, no condemnation from the African Union, no condemnation from IGAD, no condemnation from any other African heads of state up to now. Then we saw the peace negotiations in South Africa and the announcement that were made public yesterday. And myself have tried to look for information about what really it means. I haven't been able to get enough information about this. But what I can conclude is that the Tigray genocide has taught us a lesson that Africans are okay seeing fellow Africans being killed, an ethnic group under threat of being wiped out, and nothing happens in the name of African unity, in the name of the so-called African solutions for African problems. So I'll end up there. Thank you.
Zitto, thank you. That's a very demoralizing view of the situation. And I must admit that I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years wondering why it is that the African Union has not moved. And we saw this very, very early initiative of sending the 3 former African presidents, Liberian Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Mozambican Rahim Kisano, and South African Kgalema Motlanthe, just being completely blocked and stalled. And somehow the sort of energy seemed to go out of the African initiatives at that point. And it's taken a very, very long time for anything like a sort of more energetic process to initiate, which only seems to be in the last couple of weeks, perhaps with the coming on board of former President Kenyatta. Perhaps we'll come back to the issue of African solutions for African problems, but I'd like to ask Evelina now, if I may, to say something about the situation from the point of view of human rights. I know, it became clear very early in the war, as Faisal and Zitto have already said, that the scale of human rights abuses in Tigray was not any normal consequence of any normal conflict. I know that you've been working in the UK and internationally on this issue. Can you say a little bit about the response of different actors, what has been successful and what has been difficult? Over to you, Evelina.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and big kudos to the organizers for putting this session together. Indeed, from very early weeks of the conflict, we've seen evidence of atrocity crimes. We've seen evidence suggesting that the atrocities are more than just human rights violations of a normal scale, or as we can see in conflicts, but atrocity crimes that meet the legal definition even of genocide, apart from, of course, crimes against humanity. We've seen the use of conflict-related sexual violence by a litany of perpetrators, among others. And those atrocities have been documented by NGOs, human rights defenders, and many more. And unfortunately, of course, there's only a small amount of information that comes out of Ethiopia. And this has been also due to information blockage. But ultimately, the evidence that was coming from the region was so serious that of course we had to respond to it, and we had to act. And here in the UK, Lord Alton of Liverpool has been raising the issue of the situation in Ethiopia with the UK government on many occasions. And because of that, the UK government conducted its own analysis of conflict and instability. An assessment that the government normally conducts in response to conflicts in different parts of the world. But this has not been done based on the evidence that was coming out from the region, but after Lord Alton has been chasing the government again and again and again. And just a few weeks ago, the government confirmed that this assessment has been finalized, but ultimately the results have not been published yet. So Lord Alton again has been chasing the government to see the results, and of course what kind of recommendations are identified, and how is the UK government proceeding with implementing those recommendations. But of course, apart from some action here in the UK, which is very limited, and especially in comparison with other situations of concern out there, the UN has taken some important steps. And again, we can say a lot about the UN and what the UN could do, which is, of course, the UN could do certain things, but ultimately it all depends on the states that are driving action at the UN. One of the positive steps that was taken was to establish a commission of human rights experts on Ethiopia. And that was done over a year ago, or close to a year ago. And this commission of experts has the mandate to collect and preserve the evidence, analyze the evidence, and then make recommendations for Ethiopia, for the UN, for other states, which is very important. And among in the last report that the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia published, that was during the Human Rights Council session in September, they found evidence of war crimes and atrocity crimes in Ethiopia, including evidence of conflict-related sexual violence. But ultimately, at least in this report and not at this stage, the Commission has not conducted a proper assessment of the early warning signs and indicators of atrocity crimes in accordance with the UN framework for analysis of atrocity crimes. Something that is crucial to identify whether there is, for example, a serious risk of genocide in order to trigger the duty to prevent under the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And again, this is really crucial. The good thing is that this commission is already fully functioning, and they could potentially conduct this kind of analysis that could then trigger some action, and again, in accordance with the duty to prevent genocide. And just to mention what happened in relation to previous cases, and specifically the genocide in Rwanda and the genocide in Bosnia. Initially, of course, there was not much response in relation to the atrocities in those countries. But the first step that was taken was by the UN Security Council in establishing a commission of experts that collected, preserved the evidence of the atrocities and identified that, yes, there is enough evidence to say that genocide is being perpetrated. And once those commission of experts made such a strong statement that genocide may be perpetrated, that's when further steps were taken, including to ensure justice and accountability for victims and survivors. And in those two cases, that was to establish an ad hoc tribunal International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in order for them to proceed with the legal steps that can be taken to collect, preserve the evidence, to investigate, to prosecute the perpetrators, which was, of course, an important step. And one would hope that, of course, following the establishment of the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, and as they continue their work and collect, preserve the evidence, analyze this evidence, make various findings on atrocity crimes, they'll be able then, or the international community will then be able to proceed with the next step, which would be hopefully to establish some kind of ad hoc tribunal to ensure justice and accountability. But of course, the road towards such a mechanism is very long. But ultimately, the more evidence is being collected and preserved, the more, the bigger chance there is to see some kind of justice in the future. And of course, with the recent developments in Ethiopia and this ceasefire, of course, this is very important, and we all hope that this will be successful. But ultimately, of course, this should not take our attention from ensuring better assistance to victims and survivors of the atrocities as identified, and also ensuring that justice and accountability will be really at the forefront of everything what we do. Because without this justice and accountability, it will be impossible for the communities to move on with their lives and to be able to live peacefully. And actually, of course, impunity for past atrocity crimes is also one indicator of atrocity crimes in the future. So if we don't address those atrocities now, there is always a risk that this will then provide a fertile ground for future atrocities in the future. So this is something to keep in mind.
This is extremely interesting and I think helpful for our listeners. I wonder, could you say a little bit more about the indicators for atrocity crimes, as the Secretary General refers to them, genocide, other people have it. You've mentioned that past impunity is one. I understand that hate speech is another, but what are the other kinds of indicators that you think should be investigated further as a matter of urgency?
Yes, if we look at the UN framework for analysis of atrocity crimes, there are two specific risk factors that deal with genocide. The other are, for example, common indicators, common for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, but there are two specific risk factors for genocide. And the first one deals with intergroup tensions or patterns of discrimination against protected groups. So, for example, as I already mentioned, it's history of atrocity crimes committed with impunity against protected groups, a denial of the existence of protected groups or the recognition of elements of their identity, lack of national mechanisms or initiatives to deal with identity-based tensions or conflict. So many of them are indeed in relation to, first of all, recognition of the protected group and their targeting, but also past atrocities, impunity, and so on, or past and present serious tensions or conflict involving other types of groups. And then another risk factor deals with the issue of signs of an intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group. So this could be, for example, official documents suggesting that there was an order to destroy the protected group in whole or in part, or targeted physical eliminations, widespread or systematic discriminatory or targeted practices. So all those elements should help us to identify that there is specific intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. But in relation to those two risk factors that I just mentioned, of course, this is to identify the serious risk of genocide. So normally an assessment that we do before genocide is being perpetrated. And indeed, in accordance with a judgment of the International Court of Justice from 2007, the duty to prevent is to be triggered at the stage of the serious risk of genocide. We don't have to wait till genocide is being perpetrated. But of course, if we believe that genocide is already being perpetrated, then of course the analysis that we can do is to analyze the evidence against the elements of genocide, as in Article 2 of the UN Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So these are the two different analyses that we could conduct. One is in relation to the serious risk of genocide, and indeed that should have been done a while ago. And indeed, the Commission of Experts should do this analysis as well. But at the same time, as more evidence is coming from the region, we need to start looking at the analysis of the elements of the crime of genocide in accordance with Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And this work is urgently needed. And very briefly as well, a number of organizations out there produced statements and produce a short analysis of whether the serious risk of genocide or the elements of genocide identify that we see a heightened risk of genocide. That was a statement from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum just from last week. A similar statement was issued months ago. Genocide Watch issued similar statement again months ago, but ultimately we don't see proper response in relation to those statements done by non-state actors. The problem that we have right now with many states out there is that they don't do their own analysis of the serious risk of genocide, the very serious risk that triggers the duty to prevent genocide. And if they don't do their own analysis, they should at least, at minimum, respond to warnings produced by experts, produced by groups, NGOs that do this kind of work. But this is not happening as well. And in the world, only US State Department conducts its own analysis of genocide, and they produce statements and produce information in terms of where they believe that genocide is being perpetrated. They do statements in relation to situations of consent, but unfortunately other countries don't do that. And we need more states doing their own analysis of the serious risk of genocide to inform their own responses. They don't have to wait till the UN will produce a statement suggesting that they believe that there is a serious risk of genocide in Ethiopia, or that genocide is being perpetrated. They should take responsibility over their own actions and their own responses to genocide, because the duty to prevent and also to punish genocide is states' duty. States have the duty to prevent and punish, and they need to be able to implement those duties. So they need to have mechanisms that will enable them to implement their duties. I could ramble about this topic a lot. As some of our listeners may know, Lord Alton has been working on a bill that would equip the UK government to be able to implement the duty to prevent genocide. And the bill is currently before the House of Lords. It's called the Genocide Determination Bill. But of course, it's still a long way before this bill will become law, if it will become law, of course. The parliamentary process is very long. But at this stage, the UK does not have such mechanisms. And this bill would equip the UK to be able to implement its duty to prevent genocide, and potentially then, of course, help in situations where we see the serious risk of genocide and we need to act.
Ewelina, thank you very much. That's very clear. I very much appreciate what you said about the weaknesses and the slowness of the UK government approach. I completely share your view. This so-called joint assessment on conflict and stability was at least 18 months overdue when it was finally conducted. And this really is a shameful approach in my view. Let's hope that the genocide legislation now in the House of Lords will go further. But I think also what you've highlighted just how much work is needed from within the UN body, the Human Rights Council, looking both at the serious risk of genocide, but also the analysis of the elements of the crime of genocide ongoing. There's almost a parallel with what Zitto was saying about the African Union. There is something being attempted, but it just doesn't seem to be enough, and it doesn't seem to be fast enough. I wonder, perhaps we've now touched on the United States' role in this, the State Department, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. May I come back to you, Dr. Faisal? You're based in the US, and ask you to comment on the role of the US administration in all of this. I think there was a really good paper published earlier in the year by Harry Verhoeven and Mike Waldemariam, which suggested that the Trump administration had effectively encouraged the new PM Abiy's almost sort of overdeveloped sense of entitlement in 2018, 2019, and encouraged very reckless behavior, and behavior which wasn't focused on consensus or conciliation. And that seemed to shift in January 2020 when we saw very strong language from the new Biden administration. But there doesn't seem to have been as much follow through as one would have hoped, at least until recently. What happened in your view, Faisal?
Thank you very much. It's quite interesting to just look at how we as a society react when something crescendos and something happens bad. But often we ignore when things are developing. I'm saying this because in 2018, June, July, I was in Addis Ababa on my way to Nairobi and stayed there for 2 weeks. That's the same week that Isaias Afewerki is coming to Addis. He was received in a way that you can never imagine between Pole Airport and where he was going to the palace. The horses, the dances, the parades, it was something even coming from America, something as I've never seen, the reception that man got. But it happened a week before that, before I left LA. I visited the West Los Angeles Holocaust Museum, Memorial Museum, which is very rich museum, with my kids. And I watched a news clip, a video clip that's, showing what happens before, Holocaust or genocide or massacre happens. So you have a situation where elite Jewish folks, doctors, lawyers, what have you, are having lunch and dinner with their German friends with whom they belong to the same circle. And the Jewish friends are expressing their fear as to what they are feeling and what they are sensing. And the German elite friends are telling their Jewish friends, don't worry, this will never happen to you. You guys are above the common person, and don't worry, we will protect you and stuff like that. So with that, I went to Addis with that knowledge. And in that reception party given to Abiy, to Isaias that night in Asosa, the songs, the marches, the dances were all war dances in an indirect way. That really kind of reminded me of that news clip I saw. Then on my way to Nairobi, I was sitting next to a young TIGRAY doctor who worked in the Somali region, and we connected, and I talked to her. And she told me, and this is 2018, June, July, she told me how TIGRAY middle class, just like the German situation, already felt the vibe, the unspoken word, the hate speech, the messages sent to them through, hate speech covers not only the words, but also pictures and written messages and what have you. So they already felt it. And she told me that they were leaving Addis in droves. Everybody was trying to go to Mekelle to the extent possible. So when I returned to LA, I wrote an article basically anticipating and predicting the pending massacre and genocide. I actually used it as a layperson, the word genocide, and I do understand that it has legal meaning, but I could relate to what she was saying and the fear and her telling me that she may never return back to Ethiopia once she gets the chance to go to South Africa for a scholarship or training. So I think the genocide process in Tigray, if you will, or crimes against humanity, started way back before we even realized. Now we are dealing with the wreckage and how we should treat that wreckage. And all this happened under the watch of the United States of America. If you remember, the United States ambassador at the time, Tiborne, literally gave Abiy the green light to conduct what they called the uh, uh, what was that, law enforcement. And that law enforcement resulted in the death of 600,000 people, most of them, of course, combatants, but civilian is probably the largest rape in terms of scale that had happened, in my at least understanding, in the African continent, and the destruction that we all are sitting on. Why did this happen? The US had a debate, and the State Department knew all this. But again, I think diplomacy doesn't prioritize the average citizen. That diplomacy doesn't put in the center of the equation people, or even people who are, as the lawyer probably suggested, protected groups or protected people or people in the periphery. I mean, this is not new under the watch of the United States of America for something of a smaller scale than what happened in Tigray to have been carried by the. It even is happening now in a small scale in Oromia. So why? What is happening in the State Department? I think, as you said, the administration of Trump didn't have any interest in this minutia, in their opinion. They were looking at, quote unquote, the big picture. The big picture is how to hold to this country that they thought was for a long time, as Michael and his co-author wrote, used the anchor country. And as you know, Ethiopia is the maiden of the West in the Horn of Africa, in the sense that for a long time, the US had no interest, and I would underscore that word, if any, little interest in democratization and promoting democracy in Ethiopia. And in general, the United States of America for many years played or paid lip service to democratization, but didn't really pursue programs of democratization. And that's why some authors recently produced graphics and tables declining of democratic cultures throughout the world, simply because the US did not prioritize human rights. The US did not prioritize democratization. Ethiopia fits in that equation and actually holds a prominent role in not pressuring Ethiopia when it comes to protection of people or to pushing democracy. From the get-go, when Abiy started, inheriting the EPRDF regime, they knew that, the system was moving to a more consolidation of power, but with the same culture that we had under EPRDF. And the US is walked slow, and the AU, in my dismay, is what activists in spaces have been calling a club of autocrats and corrupt leaders. I mean, it's really very sad for the 7 million people of Tigray to have put their faith in the hands of AU that we knew had a good, really, write up in terms of political program and human rights protection and what have you. On paper, they have that, but in practice, I think it's a different thing. And what's painful also is that the former TPLF leaders were the ones who put a lot of energy and effort to create both the AU, the IGAD groupings, and the Bahir Dar Forum, which had its last meeting a month or 2 months ago, all of which put together language to protect indigenous and citizens of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa and in general, the entire Africa. And again, as many people would say, the word is written on those papers are probably, in the eyes of many, never used or utilized to the extent possible. The most disappointing international activity in this area, in this question of TIGRAY's genocide or crimes against humanity, belongs to two circles. Of course, AU, a very sad story, and as my former colleague said, Africa's leaders are programmed into the concept of territorial integrity, and that comes from the creation of the entire African continent. I think it was Wala Soyinka who talked about the sore spot of Africa, where he says Africa will never probably get some rest until it addresses its inherited colonial boundaries. And I think with that heritage, African leaders and African countries never prioritize gender issue, never prioritize people's rights or democratization. The prime issue that AU and all African leaders, when they come to power, utilize as populist leaders and as a concept of governance is the concept of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yesterday, as soon as the peace agreement in South Africa, he went to one of the regions and basically he played big time the concept of Ethiopia's territorial integrity and how he protected and safeguarded Ethiopia's sovereignty from the other side, from the other group, meaning TPLF. The other, disappointing is the United States, as I said, which is preservation of its anchor state, i.e. Ethiopia, and literally play or assign a secondary role to issues that most of us care, which are democratization, the protection of regional rights vis-a-vis the federal system. And in the eyes of the US, watching what's happening in Addis, we all are afraid that we are going back to the centrist system of governance in Ethiopia, which would have negative impacts on many levels of that country.
Faisal, thank you very much. And you've brought us to this issue of what sort of state for Ethiopia, centralized or decentralized. And I know that there's going to be another Twitter Space session on Saturday, I think, looking at the self-determination issue. So that debate will also continue in the week. Let me continue this issue that you've been raising of the US vis-a-vis Africa, the whole African solutions for African problems, which Zitto mentioned, and come back to you, Zitto. I mean, it seems to me there's a terrible irony in the use of this slogan as a way of shutting down international criticism of Ethiopia, saying, no, it's only Africans who have the right to be involved in this issue. I mean, my understanding is that that's a slogan that came out of the NEPAD establishment process, which was very much the brainchild of the late Meles Zenawi, and it was part of a new focus on trying to get a new commitment amongst African leaders to precisely to intervening in one another's politics when there were domestic governance issues that were going badly. So to be doing it on the continent, to be taking a much more assertive approach to the responsibility to protect, to intervene. Zitto, it seems to me it's come to mean exactly the opposite. How has that happened? And, do you think, I mean, I almost feel like the international community has started to be too hands-off as far as African politics is concerned, and there's a sort of political correctness that it must be AU-led, African-led, whether or not that's the best interests of those who are victims of these abuses or not. Over to you, Zitto, for your thoughts on this. Zitto, I think you're muted.
I think he's having some difficulty. I will check it back on off.
Zitto, can you hear me? Do you want to intervene, or otherwise I might go back to Dr. Faisal to ask him to reflect a little bit more on this issue? I mean, I think you've already made the link with history and, in a sense, the reason why the Organization of African Unity was established in the first place. It was by Haile Selassie in 1963 and very, very much associated with the whole process of territorial integrity and warding off threats to Ethiopian territorial integrity and sovereignty. Faisal, would you like to say a little bit more about that history and how it's influencing events now? Obviously, the Ethio-Somali relations have been a hugely relevant issue in this
Yeah,
point of view. And
yeah,
maybe you can also touch again on the issue of resources that you mentioned earlier.
yeah. Thank you very much. I think, although I hate to equate, and I in no way would I equate what's happening now in Tigray with what had happened to Somalis under this rubric of territorial integrity and Ethiopia's sovereignty. I think as a Somali, I'm informed by none other than the history of massacre and atrocities throughout. Uh, and I even recently wrote a letter to Prime Minister Abdi to just walk him through what had happened after one of the local parliamentarians, Jawaria Subis, was killed at the Jijiga airport by the federal, a member of the federal force. I just wanted to show him that what had happened in Jijiga today or that day has a pattern of atrocities happening against the Somalis. And often the rest of the world, the West particularly, but in African countries in general, always ignore the Somali cry, which now is probably seen by other groups such as Tigray people and Oromos. And Somalis have, for times, tried to address this issue in many ways, including through the AU by, yes, of course, invoking their rights as an independent group who have only been incorporated forcefully into Ethiopia in 1954. But even with the help of Somalia, the issue of Somalis and atrocities and massacre and Ethiopia not being uh, a good governor to Somalis went all the way to the OAU. It is quite interesting that the mediator on the Somali issue in the 1970s was also, again, a Nigerian president, Yakubu Gowon, who was selected by OAU to arbitrate between Somalia and Ethiopia on the Ogaden issue. And as it happens now, the Nigerian president never really showed any even-handedness in the issue. And in some spaces, as and some people can recall, when Obasanjo became the player, the first thing to me in his role were two things. One, he was a colonel during the Biafra uh, uh, war, and Biafra war has some similarities with the Tigray war in the sense that in both cases, food was weaponized. Starvation was used as a means to control people. And Obasanjo knew that, you know, his people, the Igbo people, went through this when he took this assignment, and he never really raised a finger. Number two, I think he was also, one of the leaders that have put Nigeria where it is today. So, Somalis have learned way back that Africa in general has a false and distorted image about Ethiopia. A Somali can say this. Many Ethiopians cannot say this. They have a distorted image of Ethiopia, and anybody can theorize as to why that happens. But Somalis were early on to learn that Ethiopia is like any other, oppressive state. Of course, it has rich history, but again, of course, it enslaved Africans and Black people, such as the Gambelans and the Benishanguls and all of that. In addition to that, it colonized people like Somalis. So early on, a Somali student of history can easily understand what Tigrayans are going through by just looking at our history, and a history that never received an audience in the West or even in Africa. Nuruddin Farah, long time ago, talked about and said Somalis went to the OAU corridors of power by speaking one language that they only understand, but the rest of Africa does not even comprehend what Somalis are saying. And he was talking about how Somalis would take to the corridors of Africa their plea about Somalis being massacred, about their women being raped in Wantam, and there is a whole literature as to how Ethiopian expression is coming from the center, just rampage villages, burning villages. There is the word that we all know and grew up with, which says Zarraf, Somali Zarraf, meaning an Aman Amdum was the general that really coined it at the time in 1964, which stands for wipe out Somalis, wipe out Somalis. And with this lullaby song is every Somali of my generation would hear that. So we have seen how Ethiopian exceptionalism co-opted the African mentality in the sense that Ethiopia is this untouchable, beautiful picture that has the only country that has a history that Europe had, kings, queens, civilizations. So in a way, I don't know if this reflects Africa's inferiority to underplay its own history by seeing a good image not in theirs but in that of Ethiopia. I don't know where that came from, but my theory is that Africa has given its entire soul to Ethiopia and never questioned. But I think the Tigray war is beginning to change that for two reasons. One, Tigray is part of the ancient Abyssinian culture and Abyssinian powerhouse. So for Tigrays to experience the same thing that Somalis and Oromos and Benishangul and others experience it in terms of genocide and massacre is probably opening up the eyes of Africa. Number two, the Tigray issue is a test and a challenge to the AU and its principles. Yes, it's a young organization with new principles in terms of, and it's aiming to really be a functional like EU and whatever by the year 2063, I believe. Those are the timeline, the horizon date that they have to be fully functional. But the way AU handles the Tigray issue is going to test whether AU can survive or not. So far, it's receiving D or E in terms of handling this issue. AU by now should have been the only mechanism that would go to the United States of America and the State Department and EU and Europe that would have, really negotiated and advocated for the protection of citizens, be it the women that have been raped in the thousands in Tigray or infrastructures and civilization is being wiped out in Tigray. So AU so far has been failing. It has not done what we expected it to do. The question is from now on, with the peace process that we started, can the AU be reliable advocate and take the message that we are talking about, the message that we are saying Africa needs to be safe, average citizen, average woman needs to be protected. Can the AU be advocate for that and take that to the State Department, which has watched, which in my opinion would have taken a different stature if the Ethiopian conflict was a European conflict, but that's another subject. So I hope AU becomes an advocate and takes the issue to the corridors of power, both in EU and in Washington, D.C.
Faisal, thank you very much. And I know that you're going to have to leave us soon. So I would like to ask you one more question, if I may, before going back to Dr. Erelina, if you have time. One of the issues which has been much talked about by those who've looked at the international relations context in which the war in Ethiopia is going on have mentioned this sort of new multipolarity, that we're no longer in the situation where there's one dominant superpower, if you like, but there are multiple poles. And I wanted to raise in particular the attitude of China and Russia. China in particular becoming much, much more dominant in politics on the continent, investment in Ethiopia and on the continent. Do you think that this slightly changing global context is relevant to the difficulty which Dr. Ewelina already touched on, and I think I want to go back to that in a moment, of some of the UN organizations being able to be as quick and as active as we would like them to have been in addressing some of these issues, whether it's human rights or the UN Security Council being able to discuss Ethiopia. Could you share your thoughts about the sort of new multipolarity of the world and the implications that has for the UN system? Are those who express fears that the sort of international system is broken in some way, are they right? Is this a much broader problem, or is there something very specific to Ethiopia's relations with the rest of the world? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think we have been there where the world is dysfunctional, but in a different context. In the 70s and the 60s, of course, the veto of the big powers were used immensely, particularly by Russia. The last time I looked at numbers, Russia's numbers of veto power and the usage of veto power is so high compared to any other uh, global force, including the US. US usually used its veto power either to oppose an upcoming African independent movement or protect Israel, whereas in those days the USSR was using it to help and support some of the liberation movements of Africa. But that has changed. I think still the division at the UN exists, but in a different context, as you alluded to the issue. I think today Russia plays a role, if you will, anti-African role than what the US does, or probably doing and playing a similar role that the US played in the past. Uh, so we have been in, we have seen similar situation, but with different content. I think still I see Russia's role, and for that matter, China, not as decisive as the US and EU, particularly when it comes to Africa. The financial support that the US and EU give to the Horn of African countries, if I just limit my discussion to that, is no way comparable to what they get from Russia and China. They may get from Russia some weapons, and you know uh, from China some, if you will, bad loans, which is what Ethiopia has experienced in the last 20 years. But the budget support that the West gives to Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, Sudan is to the tune of sometimes 60%. In the case of Somalia, even more, where some EU countries pay even salaries of the parliamentarians of that country. Abiy could not have been tamed. He would not have come to the peace negotiation that just concluded in Pretoria had it not been the tiny and yet to even increase pressures that the World Bank and the IMF and USAID indicated to put on him, and plus the protection for refugees status that was passed on the 21st of October. So I think although they play significant, although China has been seen as loaning a lot of dollars to African countries and doing some projects, but most of them through loan, some tangible projects that people would see on the ground, but in terms of the bookkeeping, that may tell a different story. I would submit to you that still the United States of America and uh, uh, EU financially are central to Ethiopia and to the Horn of Africa. So if the West, particularly United States of America, really wants to align its financial uh, muscle with the human rights issue, and also layer that with authentic developmental projects, through financing and helping Africa catch up with the rest of the world. There is no way that China or Russia can match that, and we have a long way to go to convince our leaders in the United States to go back to what Carter did in the early part of 1980s and 1978. He was the first American president to center human rights issue, and for the first time got more votes from African leaders than any other American before that. I think he was the one that who charted that. I think America needs to finally realign its human rights issues, development issues, and protection of citizens with the help that it gives to Africa. And if it does that, I could see democratization and good governance moving forth in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia.
Dr. Faisal, thank you very much. That's very clear and tremendously eloquent. That leads me back maybe to a final question to Dr. Erelina. Just to try to reflect a little bit more on the sort of politics associated with the international human rights system. You've explained very eloquently just how important the work of these systems is, whether it's UN bodies and processes, the Commission of Experts, or the Special Rapporteur on Genocide, the Rapporteur on Eritrea, and so on. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the politics there, because we've seen some very, very, well, let me be blunt, vicious and unpleasant criticism in and around the Human Rights Council recently. For instance, getting the mandate renewal for the Human Rights Commission of Experts was incredibly close vote, and many, many African countries voted against it. Of course, Eritrea has been elected onto the Human Rights Council relatively recently. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit on how that politics works and what are the pros and cons of this sort of system. But also, I mean, looking at it as a non-specialist from the outside, whether it's the NGOs or the UN, it seemed from the outside that it's been unusually difficult to get traction for the Ethiopia case as compared with other instances where there have been abuses. But is that right? Is there something particularly difficult about Ethiopia? And is that something to do with the very, very aggressive diplomatic stance which the Ethiopian government has taken? Over to you, Erelina.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's been very difficult to get attention on Ethiopia, and both at the UN, here in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. I have to say that, just mentioning again the US, I just double check with the Elie Wiesel Act reports, the annual reports that the US government is obliged to publish. And they identify Ethiopia on a number of occasions already, that the atrocity crimes happening there. But we still don't have a formal determination of the atrocities as genocide. At this stage, we don't know whether the State Department is doing this analysis or not. But definitely Ethiopia is on their radar. And they also identify what steps they're taking in order to address the atrocities, which again is the only country that actually provides this kind of transparency in relation to their responses to atrocities and cases that they're monitoring. And we would love to see it from other governments as well. But despite some attention from the US, the different reports shedding light on the situation in Ethiopia, again, there is very little engagement on the topic of Ethiopia. One of the big problems is, of course, that there are so many different situations of concern at this stage, and the attention span on such situations is very short. And we've seen that how the attention moved from the situation of the Yazidis to in Iraq, to the situation of the Rohingyas in Myanmar, to the situation of Uyghurs in China, then a little bit on Ethiopia, but very little attention. And now Ukraine, of course, is the main topic. So unfortunately, it's there is a bit of a it's a horrible word to use, but competition for attention between those different situations. And unfortunately, there is also this conflict fatigue or atrocity fatigue that we've seen, that people don't want to hear about it for a very long period of time. And once it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And then, of course, we need people in various countries to be focused on the situation, to care about the situation, to then move the politicians to act and move the governments to act. It's this vicious circle of that we continue to struggle with in order to ensure that various cases receive the attention that they require, and as long as they require this attention. So unfortunately, it's to some extent a lost game in terms of trying to engage on those topics again and again and again. In terms of the Human Rights Council, of course, we have a small number of countries at the Human Rights Council, and they're representative of regions. And as you mentioned, indeed, from this year, for the next 2 years, we have Eritrea among those countries. We have also Sudan. We have until next year, 2023, we have China. And in all those countries, we are talking about serious human rights violations perpetrated by those countries. And of course, they will try to stop anything that criticizes them. And the best example is China, with a resolution or quasi-resolution that was blocked just a few weeks ago. And that was meant to only provide some time at the Human Rights Council to discuss a report about atrocity crimes in China, as produced by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And this was blocked because China did not want anyone to interfere in as they say, domestic issues. And as we could see from the countries that were voting against that quasi-resolution, we could see what is happening in the background as well, and the different relationship between countries, the assistance that China provided to a number of countries that then ultimately voted against that quasi-resolution. So unfortunately, all those games are there, and we have to be always concerned about those different relationships, because ultimately they will mean whether a step, especially at the UN Human Rights Council, is going to be successful or not. At the UN General Assembly, we have, of course, a larger pool of countries that we could try to engage. But again, the same games that we've seen at the Human Rights Council will take place at the General Assembly as well. But it's all about trying to identify which countries would be willing to support any kind of steps, and whether we'll get majority over there. And just very briefly, in relation to what was said as well about the optimism, the unfounded optimism that no atrocity crimes will be perpetrated in Ethiopia, that we won't see genocide. I think we are learning more and more about that. Atrocity crimes can happen anywhere in the world, and I think right now we here in Europe we have some kind of a reality check as well with Putin's war in Ukraine and an ultimate serious risk of genocide or incitement to genocide as perpetrated by Putin. So I think initially, and my friends were also telling me that, oh, it's not going to happen. Russia is not going to attack Ukraine. Putin would have to be crazy to do that. But then we have this reality check, and we see that we have now one of the worst atrocity crimes happening on European soil in many years, and it can happen anywhere. And we need to be vigilant, and we need to have, again, mechanisms to identify early warning signs and risk factors. We cannot rely on this unfounded optimism that something is not going to happen. That's not what the Genocide Convention requires us to do. This is not what the duty to prevent talks about. And just very brief comment, again, in relation to the argument that of course we don't want interference from other states. We want to deal with the issue domestically. This is something again that we've heard also with China, and when the quasi resolution was being debated, and this was mentioned again and again by China and countries supporting China and voting against that quasi resolution. They were saying that it's China's domestic issue. We should not interfere with state sovereignty. And this is not an argument that was used when we saw the Nazi atrocities in Europe. So we need to again be mindful of the fact that as states we have duties, and we accepted those duties, and again the duty to prevent genocide, and it's something that we should be raising again and again and again. And there are certain obligations that we have, and if we want to deliver on the promise of never again, we need to take those duties seriously, and again stop relying on this unfounded optimism that something is not going to happen without looking at evidence, without looking at early warning signs, and seeing what is before our eyes. And I will stop here, but if there's any question, I will try to respond.
Evelina, thank you very much. That was extremely helpful and clear and eloquent. I think your point about competition for attention or the bandwidth issue has been very, very visible in a number of different contexts. I think we saw it with the conversation with the US sanctions people basically agreeing with the criticisms coming to them that they should be looking more seriously at sanctions, but clearly overwhelmed with a number of different cases that they're having to look at globally. I think that's also very clear in the human rights context, that much, much more resource is needed to be able to pursue these issues as effectively as possible. I'm just wondering if we can do something slightly unorthodox. I know that Zitto has been having some technical problems and Dr. Faisal has had to leave us, but we do have Sedale Lema with us this evening, who I know has been following very closely some of the dynamics of watching what the international community has and hasn't been able to do, particularly in relation to holding Ethiopia's politicians to account. So Dali, I think you and I agree quite strongly that this was always a political problem, not something that was that should ever have been resolved in a resorting to violence. So I wondered if you would like to say something about the issue of holding Ethiopia's politicians to account for some of the things which have happened to civilians over the last 2 years, and perhaps also comment on the very latest events of the last 24 hours. We know that there's a peace agreement which was supposed to have come into effect today, but we also know that there have been some reports of further attacks which have been, with bombings reported in Tigrayan towns of Maicho and Adigrat today. Those, as far as I know, those reports are unconfirmed, but I don't know whether or not they're correct. So is it possible to unmute Sedale or Maaza? Would you like to come in and comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Tadala is going to join us briefly, but I think I could speak to what you just mentioned at the end.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, it hasn't been more than 24 hours since the so-called peace agreement has been signed. The people of Tigray still haven't heard from the delegates that were there representing the people, and we still haven't heard really the details from the Tigrayan side, but still we are clearly seeing that the Abiy Ahmed and regime is not truly committed for a peaceful resolution, and that is reflected in the fact that there has been an active multiple drone attacks targeting civilians across Tigray, killing innocent civilians. So, I mean, I studied quite a bit in politics and negotiation, and what I am seeing from Abiy Ahmed is really an indicative of an actor that is ready and committed for peaceful resolution. If anything, he is doubling down on his genocidal intent, and I think, um, as it has been the case for the past 2 years, Abiy Ahmed is using peace talks as a tactic to steal more time and to inflict more pain on the people of Tigray. And it is for this very fact that even yesterday, once when the peace agreement was announced, a lot of Tigrayans were on the edge because um, multiple time and multiple occasions the Abiy regime has proven to be an actor that is not committed to adhere to norms of negotiation peace. So um, what we saw today, what we heard from Tigray today, has even solidified the suspicion we had with regards to Abiy's true intention. And it's quite unfortunate that the interlocutors, the mediators, continue really to embolden such kind of action from Ethiopia's side, while they're well aware of the genocidal regime's intent and character when it comes to respecting rules and regulations. So um, what we just heard today makes us even more wary, and we're extremely concerned for the well-being of the Tigrayan people. But that's just my opinion, and Tadal is here, so I don't want to hold too much space.
Martha, thanks very much. Sadala, do you mind being jumped on out of the blue and asked to contribute here? We would really very much like to hear your observations from your perspective.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
I'm sorry, Sarah. I was trying to sort it out. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Hi, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thank you, Zitto and Faisal and Dr. Evli for this beautiful presentation. I'm not sure what more is there to say after so many powerful presentations like that, but to say a couple of things that, because Sarah, you raised it. Yes, we are following the reports of the drone attacks today after the ceasefire is agreed upon yesterday. But this is really exactly emblematic of the very troublesome relationship the West and the rest of the world continued to have with regard to this war in Ethiopia, which is that the fact that the world has collectively failed to have Tigray opened up for the media, for independent observers, is giving that kind of perfect cover of the plausible deniability. You get to hear from activists, from the few sources that are able to speak up from the field of Tigray, and you do nothing about it because you doubt the question, the events that are happening. Exactly, as Sarah, as you say it now, we cannot be sure whether that happened or not. So you can see Tigrayans screaming and crying and posting pictures of victims of airstrikes and or extrajudicial killings and everything, and you are still second guessing that information because it is coming from Tigrayan activists. Why? Because you have normalized the sealing of the siege on Tigray, that the prevention of journalists from being on the ground. It gives that perfect plausible deniability to the international community. And so the most troublesome aspect of the relationship between the Ethiopian government today and the West is that it's always excusable. And we have seen initially during the war some strong statements coming in the first few months of the war, be it from the State Department, be it from the European Union and others, particularly to the transatlantic um, um, alliance, even forming against the condemnation of the war. But it didn't go anywhere. It just ended being a commotion of issuing statements of concern, one statement of concern after the other, and that immediately being taken and interpreted by the Ethiopian government as being speaking for the TPLF, right? And when the government comes after them, or when government supporters come after them, we have seen diplomacy caving in for that kind of intimidation and pressure, and caving in for speaking up against atrocities. And we have also seen some initiatives of sanctioning um, the government. For example, the US government, the executive order you can mention of President Biden, which is nothing but just paper. It's not even worse the paper it's written on. It happened nothing. We have seen Eritrean generals and a few people being targeted for sanctions, but none in Ethiopia. Be it, everybody says all parties involved, keeps talking about involvement of all parties in atrocities and everything, and that this executive order was going to individually target people suspected of participating in human rights violations, but nothing has happened. The same is true with the designation of the war, whether this constitutes genocide or not. Nothing happened again. It was shelved by the state, but the pressure from the State Department. We have seen also Secretary Blinken initially outspoken about the war, and that he giving testimony that what has happened in Western Tigray was by the Amhara militia and Eritreans and also Ethiopian Defense Forces amounts to ethnic cleansing. What has happened to that? Nothing has happened to those powerful statements that Secretary Blinken did, and that they were corroborated by reports from human rights organizations after that. It's not for lack of evidence that no action was taken so far. And so we have seen the initial phase of strong engagement that would give you the hope that that kind of intervention would eventually save Ethiopia from self-cannibalizing itself, fell into some kind of what can I say? Eventually, the measure of diplomacy itself has reduced itself into counting trucks. The measure of it was reduced into counting money and celebrating that as the biggest achievement when Tigray was placed under complete siege. It's a diplomatic engagement, don't forget that, failed to even convince the Ethiopian government that it's not okay to put 7 million people under this kind of medieval type of siege with no communication and everything. So when you measure it at the end, it became nothing but a celebration of success by the number of trucks that were allowed into Tigray, a celebration of success by the number of money birr that were for their own services, the humanitarian organizations. They need the finance to be able to deliver and everything. It was reduced into counting the amount of birr that was allowed into Tigray, counting the number of liters of fuel that could be allowed to get into Tigray. It was never okay for the international community and also for diplomacy to say enough was enough, that a government cannot be at this day and time allowed to punish 7 million people collectively like that. So I think part of the reason that constitutes to this kind of spectacular failure by the international community to stop that is the fact that the government of Abiy Ahmed under his leadership has become a client state of the capitalist world, with all the promises that the prime minister has given to the West in terms of liberalizing, in terms of privatizing state assets that were absolutely off limit under the EPRDF. So there's that ideological factor that was coming in clashes with the moral authority of the West and stopping this kind of cruelty that was happening in a country that's really an anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. So there is that. We have seen interests coming in the way of Western diplomats to speak against what was happening. This is one aspect of it that we often don't talk about it. The other aspect, as someone who has worked at an embassy for 6 years and how diplomatic cables function, is to me is the fact that most of the cables that are produced in the country, diplomatic cables, and are sent to respective foreign offices of the countries, are often compiled by Ethiopian staff on the ground. And we have seen the misunderstanding, we have seen the accomplices of so many Ethiopians into this war. We have seen people mistakenly commenting, for example, for using their organization's account, Twitter account or Facebook accounts, commenting on some undesirable comments under that. We're not paying attention the contribution of what kind of factual information is being passed over through these diplomatic cables to respective foreign offices from embassies and international organizations based in Addis Ababa. This requires its own research, and I'm sure there's so many accounts that you would find absolutely shocking if we look into those things. We're not discussing those things. So all in all, it's really a failure, and it's a tragic failure that has led us to where we are today. So coming back to the attacks today, the drone attacks, the reported drone attacks, there is the plausible deniability of the cessation of hostilities that was signed yesterday. So nobody's going to come up and speak a bit about it, right? Besides it having the proclivity of being denied, because we just don't know what's happening on the ground. Besides that cessation of hostilities is going to give cover for silence response by the international community. The same things have happened in the past. Whenever there is a possibility of talks, or whenever there is some kind of inclination the federal government was showing in terms of restraining itself, there has always been that early applause to do that. And then you discuss with diplomats and you brief and you tell them, they will tell you, like, we want to give this one a chance. We want to see if this is going to work. So it has always been positioned to this kind of non-committed response, which has always been attached to their own interests, and their own interest in that aligns with what the Ethiopian government has today to offer. Ethiopia is opening up its banking. These are areas under the EPRDF that were off limit, and were also a point of contention between the West and the EPRDF's developmental state policy. Well, and so today that barrier is lifted up. Nobody wanted to spoil it. So if Tigray is the price for that, so be it. That's how I see it. So this is what I could say in short, Sarah, and thanks for having me.
Sadale, thank you very much indeed. I had some technical issues, so I didn't hear all of that, but I really very much appreciate the sentiment that I did hear. I think the messages are extremely clear from our session this evening, from all of our different speakers in different perspectives. This issue of plausible deniability and doing nothing because you doubt is absolutely critical. I think we all recognize that has been part of our experience the last 2 years. It's so difficult to know what's going on, but there are ways in which the international community could make it much easier to know what's going on. What we need is a much more courageous set of international actors. That's what Ewelina, what Sadale, what Faisal, and what Zitto have told us. We need a much more proactive international community, one with better resourced investigative power, much closer monitoring of this new peace agreement that may or may not persist. We need, for instance, the satellite data and imagery which is accessible to governments to be used as a basis for calling out if there really are breaches of this cessation of hostilities agreement. It's too important just to be left to run for its own sake, under its own steam, and everybody just saying, okay, well, Ethiopia's sorted out, we can look away now. That's not going to be good enough. We've absolutely got to spend the next 2 years working in a very, very different way than we did the last 2 years. So I want to thank you all for your contributions to this session. And in closing, I'd like to quote a tweet which was sent just a few hours ago by a colleague at the UN, Kwesi Sankalot Greenwich. He just tweeted something which I think should touch all of us and really sums up much of what this session has been about. He said, what we have allowed to be normalized over the last 2 years, normalized again, that word that Sadale has also just used. What we have allowed to be normalized over the last 2 years will not only haunt us forever, but has also made the world and us with it less human. That's why this matters. It matters to all of us, and it matters to all of those who we can influence and continue to influence by the work that we do. Maaza, back to you, and thanks very much for organizing tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. That was quite a powerful message, powerful closing remark. Thank you so much for all that you do. We're truly grateful for the scholars, for the speakers, advocates, and experts who have joined us today here. Thank you so much for your continued solidarity to the people of Tigray that continue to face a state-imposed genocide at the hands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Thank you so much for your expertise and openings that have helped our advocacy work in so many ways. Thank you so much for shining light on different issues at a moment where the world has completely forgotten the people of Tigray. You individuals, experts, have been at the front line to raise awareness, but also to expand our understanding of the very complicated international relations and how the rights of the people of Tigray could be protected in that realm. We're truly grateful to Dr. Olin, Adal as always, Zitto, and Faisal, particularly and especially Dr. Sarah, for making the time to be here to moderate this discussion and for the distinguished speakers to share your opening. Thank you so very much. We want to emphasize the fact that we had this discussion today at the backdrop of Tigray still being attacked and bombarded from different angles, both by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. And this is clearly an indication of the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments that they don't have the commitment nor the intention to respect rules and regulations of the international community and are still committed to exterminating the people of Tigray. And we call upon all members of the international community, particularly the US government that has been spearheading the peace talks, to really pay careful attention and to take significant measures that could actually bring about measurable change on the ground. Everything that we have seen so far is the normalization of the killing, the suffering, and the raping and the starvation of the people of Tigray. Nothing short of a punitive measure is going to change the behavior of both the genocidal forces in Addis Ababa and in Asmara, while the people of Tigray, myself included, are truly committed to peaceful resolution to this conflict, but we're very much concerned that nothing short of a punitive measure will change the nature and the behavior of the genocidal actors that have taken so many lives so far. So we we urge everybody not to fall into the traps of the propaganda nor the peace talks that has been signed yesterday, and to truly take measures that can save lives. This doesn't mean that we want the war to continue. We want it to come to an end, but we want it to come to an end with a meaningful end. We want to see justice and accountability. The people of Tigray, particularly the women that have endured the weaponized rape both by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, deserve justice. They deserve justice. They deserve justice. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. There cannot be sustainable peace in the absence of justice and accountability. The young men and women that were hunted from their homes and massacred in the broad daylight, including in churches and mosques, they deserve justice. The over 600,000 civilians that were killed and died due to lack of medication and starvation deserve justice. There cannot be peace and stability not only in Tigray, Ethiopia, but also the Horn of Africa in the absence of a mechanism that will truly bring about accountability to those who have perpetrated these crimes. Like one of the speakers earlier said, if we're going to give precedent to political expediency at the expense of accountability, it will not only embolden the Ethiopian government to commit further crimes across the country, but also other dictatorial regimes that might be waiting to exterminate whoever opposes their brutal dictatorship. So it's really important. And I think superpowers across the world, particularly the US government, is being tested, whether it stays true to its commitment to expand to democratization and protecting human rights, or it is willing to turn a blind eye to areas where such kind of atrocities are committed, so long as it doesn't necessarily affect what it deems as its national interest. So with that closing remark, I leave you all, but I urge everybody to still to continue raising your voices and sounding the alarm about the dire circumstance the people of Tigray are in. And I urge members of our community, particularly the Tigrayans, not to give in. I know these are extremely painful and dark times, but we have endured so much worse, and our people in Tigray need us to be resilient and to continue to advocate on their behalf. Nothing is certain at this moment, and that makes it far more important for us to stay united and strong, believing in our just cause, our causes of justice, our cause of democracy. So, Jonah, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. We'll continue to have this series tomorrow and the day after. There are important topics that we will discuss tomorrow. So I kindly ask everybody to stay in the loop. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We're truly grateful. Have a wonderful day.
لو تغينا مسك نوفى لنا نفريه بنا كنتبع لنا سبسي أي تفرحي نحق فرح نزقيها فرحي